I guess in 2026, there's really no reason why you need to literally log into a tool's dashboard and be held to their design choices. Now, a lot of time and energy and tokens were spent to design the layout and user interface of ContentGrapher. I would know so because I spent all that time, energy, and tokens. But this may not really work for you. And for those of you who are like me, who prefer to work within a Claude Code or Codex instance to do things, this may make more sense. And the reason why I'm telling you this, especially to my freelancer and agency folk, is when you are a paying user of ContentGrapher, you will then get access to an API, which you can generate a key and then follow the instructions to connect to ContentGrapher's MCP server. Here's a particular blog post that is on a friend's website, and I want to check it for structural completeness. Now, I could go into ContentGrapher and run it through the UI, or I could simply connect it to the ContentGrapher MCP server and ask whatever I want. Now, for my particular purpose, I have created a custom skill. It uses, I believe, GLM 5.2 as the model to rewrite the content. And for transparency, it is not a one-shot prompt. Quite a significant amount of time, energy, and tokens were spent to finesse the output. And that's with any model you choose. And that's going to be the same irrespective of how you are going to use the MCP. And so what's going to happen is using this particular skill, and for your instance, if you connect to it, you'll instruct it to run ContentGrapher, and it will go through phase 1 and phase 2, and it will check for your account's credits and then go through the normal phase. Now, an interesting fact is when you run it through the MCP using your API key, what happens is when you go back to the web UI of ContentGrapher, once the report and analysis is complete, it will show up in your history. So you can, if you desire to, look at the entire thing and cross-reference it, but you don't need to because I've done that and checked that it makes sense. So this, similar to if you were to run it through the UI, will take a few minutes to run through phase 1. And then phase 2, which if you've already used ContentGrapher, you know will take 2 to 3 minutes to develop the writing agenda and the covering matrix and the page architecture, because that is the most significant portion of the tool in terms of output. Because now that it has taken, for example, all the entities on your page, it then needs to figure out how do they relate to each other? How have you specified that? Have you done a good job, or do you need to do a better job? And that essentially is what ContentGrapher does, right? And the initial rollout of the tool limited you to this particular interface, whereas now, if you are using Claude Code like I am, or with Codex, you can simply run it through your own workflow. And as this run, I'll just talk you through how I would use this. And that is typically, if this were, let's say, for example, this were not an existing piece of content yet, and I wanted to write content for a client, I would go through the usual pipeline, and that is probably draw from a data for SEO API or SEMrush or Ahrefs API. And what that would do is get me the keyword research. It would get me the competitor research by locale and by SERP. And then that would be used to inform the output and structure from a content perspective and search intent perspective of what this content should look like. Then I would feed it into the actual content pipeline using an LMM to create the content based on the brief, which draws from either data for SEO or SEMrush or Ahrefs or whatever SEO tool that you want. And that would get us to something like this at the end once you publish it. And I would think of ContentGrapher as the last mile of content optimization workflow. And that is, you've got all the insights, you've got what's ranking, you know what is performing well and what your competitors are talking about in terms of the content. Now you want to see, have you covered it adequately so that AI systems can understand what you are talking about or what you wish to communicate via that content. So coming back to Claude Code, we can see that phase 1 and phase 2 has completed, and your output will be very different because I've instructed my skill to be very, very minimal in its output and focus on rather the JSON of, so outputting all the recommendations of the JSON. So if I refresh this, let me prove to you that it does in fact show up. And I believe it was this: when should you buy your wedding dress? And 71% coverage score. Coming back to here, score is 71%. And what's interesting is, based on this piece of content, ContentGrapher has already decided that, hey, you've covered the expected concepts. Now, out of the 15, 11 are well integrated. So that leaves 4 more concepts that are mentioned but are weakly woven into the page. And you'll see in terms of the 2x2 quadrant, a bunch of recommendations in terms of things to make explicit, which are relatively high impact and low level of effort. And then you have your strategic things, which are your high impact and high effort, kind of impact effort, in terms of what you should add to the content. And for the context of this topic, it's add overseas shipping delays, add weight loss delay. Wow, I don't know if I want to do that. And then venue formality in the context of the topic, which again is wedding dress purchase timing. And then if we come back to here, what my particular skill does is it then calls a model, GLM 5.2 for this instance, to then ingest those recommendations, which are all these things, right? And then rewrite the content so that it makes sense. So it's not just adding this sentence, it's more taking the concept and principle of this recommendation, analyzing the overall content itself, and then finding the best way to insert it into here that still follows the tonality and the way of writing that is on this particular website. So coming back to here, you'll see that for my particular skill, it is now, or rather GLM is now rewriting the post. And when you connect it to your Claude Code instance, you're not going to have that, right? You're not going to have that ability to immediately address the recommendations and write them, and in this instance, actually push it to headless Sanity. That's just something that I've created because that is my workflow. And the reason why I'm showing you this in a very long-winded video is to help you visualize or imagine how you could integrate this into your own workflow. So the first thing is, of course, you are no longer limited by this particular layout and presentation. Even though if you were to take the client link and you paste it, it is, in my opinion anyway, even though I'm very, very biased, quite a very useful and in-depth and actionable a set of instructions that you could then take away to your LLM of choice, and you could consider this as a content brief, or you add your own content brief to this and give it instructions of how you want it to adopt this type of recommendation. Or you could pass this, or you could pass this whole thing along to a fellow member of your team or to a vendor to then action it as an actual human being, to then take the recommendations, reflect upon it, and then integrate it in the most meaningful way that makes sense to them. And so this really is just to show you how I integrate it into my workflow. It might be very different to you, but again, if you work agency side or you freelance and you have multiple clients spanning multiple verticals and they have a lot of content that you would like to optimize and ensure that AI can objectively understand it by mapping out all the concepts and entities on it, and to ensure that the correct and appropriate relationships are clearly and explicitly mentioned instead of being inferred, then you could do so at scale, because this is just one Claude Code instance. What I haven't talked about is how could you then make this into a repeatable agentic workflow? And that's where something like Claude Cowork would come in. Once you set it up, you pretty much set up a skill, a schedule, and then you just run it at scale. And so now we are seeing my particular skill rewrite successfully. It's then pushed it to Sanity, the headless CMS, and it's done that successfully. And it has then reanalyzed the same URL, but now updated. And let me prove that it did that, and I'm not lying. So right now you can see that this was published 20 of July 2025. Let's duplicate this, and it's actually refreshed it, and you can see that now there's an updated metadata tag, and that is, this is now updated 30th of June 2026. And hopefully we can see there are some obvious or perhaps not so obvious differences, right? So code from the top, pretty much the intro is pretty much the same. H1's the same, I think. Now there's definitely some differences. Looks like it's cut away that preamble, which is interesting. And then H2s are relatively the same, but bolding's different. Oh, interesting. Something I need to think about in my own workflow is it needs to retain the formatting, and that means the JSON needs to have that, which it probably hasn't passed on, and I obviously haven't instructed GALM to look out for that. So that's something that I'm mindful of. And then looks like there's definitely some more depth around some areas. I need to figure out why are there such big gaps here, but that's not relevant right now. That seems to be a styling choice. And then you can see here, what? Okay, so again, I need to, in my skill, need to apply formatting in the form of bullet lists. But in terms of content, we can see it has expanded some things. Again, formatting, I need to fix that. But one thing it has retained at least are the internal links. That is great. But what it looks like this, there's some existing formatting that I did not do well, which is here, that I need to fix up. But again, that's a quick fix. But again, we're looking at the pre and post, and you can see from here, what if you're waiting to lose weight before buying your wedding dress? The H2 is the same, but the content has built that out a bit. And that is because of this. What to add? Add a passage that names weight loss delay as one of the most common reasons brides buy too late, and explain the blah, 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 blah. And there's an example. And when we look over here, that's probably exactly what GLM has done based on the output from the analysis. So again, my output is different because I've instructed the skill to give me this output. But what we can see now is originally the coverage score, or the question coverage, was 69%. Now it's 88%, but the coverage started at 71%. Now it is 88% with a delta of plus 17 percentage points. So that's pretty damn good, in my opinion, for an LMM written content taken from ContentGrapher. Then in terms of the concepts, originally 15, it was 11 out of 15. Now it's 13 out of 15. And again, the question coverage rate from 69 to 88%. Now remember, when we first looked at this, it already said it was complete. So structurally, it was complete. And these things are probably optional for you. But for the purpose of this demo, it's like, well, why don't we run it again and see how we could improve upon it? Because 71%, well, that doesn't sound so great. And in my opinion, 88% coverage score sounds a lot better than 71%. So to prove this to you, let's duplicate this tab again, and let's open the newer one, which is, as you can see here, it was 71%. Now it's 88%. And there are still a few things which the tool has listed as quick wins that you could consider doing. But again, it is from a coverage or structural completeness perspective, it is complete. And what the tool then tells you essentially is, hey, look, it's time to call it a day. Like, this is structurally complete for this topic. Anything else that you do will have diminishing returns. And here is the proof. Like, here are all the concepts. And you have literally explained them very well. So that is how, or this is how, I use Claude Code connecting to the ContentGrapher MCP server allows me to do things my way without having to rely on a user interface or a dashboard of a tool. And it lets me do things really quickly in my reference, or my preference rather. And you've seen it run live. You've seen a few bugs on my side, not so much the tool, but rather my prompt in terms of how do I instruct the LMM to ingest content and keep formatting, which it hasn't done here. But that's something that I can work separately on this, on my friend's content. But the takeaway here is, I guess, again, you don't have to be limited to a particular UI. You can integrate ContentGrapher into your existing workflow. And again, for me, I use it as the last mile in terms of content optimization. I feed it into an existing workflow that gets published, and then I can run it through. Or, but alternatively, it doesn't have to be a live URL, right? Even in ContentGrapher, you can, instead of putting in a live URL, you can connect it to a Google Doc. You can upload a Word doc or even an MD file or paste text here. So it doesn't have to be a live published URL. Whatever works for you, right, is the goal. Now, in terms of MCP, I'm not entirely sure. I haven't tested it out, how we could do it with a content doc that's uploaded or with pasted text. That's something that I'll definitely try out after recording this video. But for any content optimization work streams that you have planned, you can most definitely, as you've seen here, run it through the MCP server, and it's up to you where you want to take it. So, time for you to give it a go. Paste in your URL, connect the MCP, buy some credits, and see where your content is at.